Thanks everyone for coming and welcome to Swans HQ and to those who might be listening online. As you all know and aware by now, John and I are here to formally acknowledge and announce the retirement of Lance Franklin. Before John and I speak of his profound impact, I just want to address his absence at the moment. As we know, Lance is an unbelievably private person. Had a very private conversation with John this morning, probably speaking to how quickly this has moved. Addressed his teammates at lunchtime today, and from a club's point of view, we are absolutely comfortable with that. So appreciate we probably all want to hear from Lance, and I'm sure that will happen in time, but this has moved really quickly. Just before I do pass to John, and speaking on behalf of Lance, and I'm sure we've all seen it, his impact on this football club, the game of AFL more broadly, specifically the game of AFL in Sydney, has been profound, and has really been probably the player of his generation that's transcended the game and had such a strong positive impact on the community. He'll be enormously missed, but he absolutely goes knowing that he exhausted every last inch of his mind, body, and from the Sydney Swans, and I'm sure on behalf of the whole AFL community, we wish him, his wife Jacinta, his two kids, Rocky and Tallulah, all the very best for what's next. Clearly we've got another month at least to go, and as I say, at the right time I'm sure we will hear from Lance, but for now, from the Swans' point of view, just officially acknowledging his retirement effective immediately. John.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Obviously everyone would have loved to have had Lance available. It's a significant player in the history of the game, and but I just ask everyone to respect the fact that he just doesn't like these situations, and I guess it's you have to respect that because he's been a superstar of the game, and he's in a situation where he's most comfortable out in the footy ground, and everyone sees the way he walks around a footy ground and thinks it's just him 24 hours a day. That's not. He's very shy, very humble. Obviously what happened on Saturday night, I spent a little bit of time with him in the change rooms after the game, and then I got some news last night. I guess after he had his scan, it was probably going to be a sort of a 6-week type scenario with his calf, 6 to 8 maybe. And he rang me. I was going to ring him, but I was on a plane to come back to Sydney. This was later last night. So he then rang me when I was sitting on the plane. He was pretty emotional and devastated that could be the way it's finished. It certainly sounded like he'd made the call there and then. I said, we'd just have a sleep on it and we'll get up and have a chat this morning, and went to his place this morning. He had a good night's sleep. He felt a lot better today, but he made the decision clearly. He said that last time he'd had a calf injury like that, it was in the same spot, and he'd missed probably 10, 12 weeks of football, of training. This was over the pre-season, 10 to 12 weeks. So he said, I'm done. And I think the best way to do it is to call it now. And he wanted to come in and speak to his teammates, which he's done. And he moves on to the next phase of his life. So we're very lucky to have, obviously clearly experienced one of the all-time greats, and I feel really privileged to be able to have coached him for a portion of his career, a large portion of his career, and I think we're all grateful for watching him. Over to you guys.
John, is it almost cruel that a player that's had such a profound impact on the game has to end his illustrious career?
No, I don't think it's cruel at all. I think that next week, I don't think you'll remember it. The week after, I don't think everyone thinks about it at the moment, when he sits there after he's hurt his calf. But if you give yourself time, over the period of time you reflect on Lance Franklin's career, I don't think anyone will make a big deal of that. You'll just remember the high times and how much of a gun player he was. And sometimes these things happen. It's just part of life.
Have you ever coached a player like Buddy?
No, I've never. No, certainly not. And from the moment he walked in here, his ability to be able to, on the training track, do what he did and then see him in games, he's probably one of the most competitive people I've ever met. Whether that's in a game of AFL football, whether it's training, whether it's on the table tennis table, He was extraordinarily competitive, and he's one of the all-time greats, obviously, of our generation.
Can you talk about this morning? How did the boys get around him after his announcement?
Well, he just came in and just spoke to the players, and Jess was in here with the kids, and they just talked about it, and it gave him a hug. As you'd expect, it was. He handled it really well. He was able to be clear and concise with what he said, and he was just said, missing the players was going to be the real challenge, because he loves being in the locker room with the boys and loves competing on weekends. But there comes a time, and he was terrific with the players.
Can you feel the gap that he's left already?
I don't think you ever feel a gap left by Lance Franklin, but the reality is the game moves forward, and we'll move forward.
John, you got to coach him. Before that, you had to coach against him. What was that sort of challenge like? Against a player like that?
A much bigger nightmare than was coaching him, I tell you. It's I still remember the 2012 grand final, and he'd beaten us quite a few times off his own boot almost, it felt like, and Teddy Richards hurt his ankle really badly in the prelim final. And I said to Teddy the week before that game was, it's okay, your ankle should be okay, mate, even if it's a bit sore, it doesn't matter, you're only playing on Lance Franklin. So, and he went out and played on him then, but it was a nightmare, because you put a bloke who was as tall on him and he'd beat you at ground level and beat you with speed. You put a smaller bloke on him and he'd outmark you. He was almost impossible to match up on. And the good thing is that we've seen over the last few weeks, he went out in pretty good nick, and I think that's what he's sort of. I'm sure in the fullness of time, he'll look back on the last few weeks and think he was still playing pretty good footy. I think that'll give him some comfort.
And having a player like that, when you're coaching and you're making all these moves, and sometimes was it ever just, we'll just kick it to Lance and he'll just win the game for us?
Not really. It wasn't like that, although sometimes because he was such a competitive beast, he just lived at those moments. The best players lift at the moments they need to, and the game's in the balance. And he did that all the time. And it wasn't necessarily always about his impact on the scoreboard, but he was probably the most beautiful field kick I'd ever seen. And when he was playing, particularly early days when he was able to train more, he'd get up the ground and he's just a beautiful athlete. He'd run all over the place and he'd spear passes inside 50 and do that regularly. And so he just had this amazing ability to be able to lift when the game was on the line and not do it once or twice. He did it most times.
What will be his farewell or send-off?
For
the fans, or do you
Tom?
have a plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think you probably all appreciate how quickly this moved in the last 24 hours, and so the immediate focus has just been on that, and Lance's immediate focus was on his family first, conversation with John, and then obviously the teammates. So we will all hear from Lance at the right time, and once the dust settles, we'll have conversation with Lance about that. He certainly knows the impact that he's had on not just the Swans fans, but AFL fans and sports fans in general. And he, as to John's point, senses moments, and I'm sure at the right time we'll get across that. And like we've been saying, I guess as a club for the last year or so, just enjoy what he's doing for the time that he's out on the field, because you never know when it ends, and it ends today pretty abruptly. So we'll address that the next couple of weeks.
John, you talk about transcending the game, or both of you did. Can you talk about what Buddy has done for AFL in Sydney and in New South Wales more broadly in terms of box office, drawing crowds year on year?
Well, first,
the game looked like pre and post.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think the game was growing anyway, and certainly, if you look at the back of the 05, 06 grand finals, 2012, we were sort of, and the interest in the game was certainly growing over that period because of a reasonably successful team. And then Lance, when he came here, it went to another level. I first got a bit of a sense of what we're in for when our first training session, there was a couple of helicopters circling up above, and I thought, this is a bit different. And he brought a whole new generation of fans. I think we're already on our way as far as being a competitive team, and we had a really strong supporter base. And then when Lance came, he added another generation, another level, and the interest went through the roof. And most importantly, though, he kept us competitive. And when you're going through different stages of a team, you're losing players, and during that period, you've got to try and keep winning. And he was able to help us do that and help us transcend the generational changes that we were making in our team, and along the way keep us absolutely competitive, which is always the most important thing from my perspective. From Tom's perspective, I'm sure he helped just get people and get bums on seats.
From the non-AFL fan or non-Swans perspective, New South Wales is rugby league heartland. Do you think Buddy really helped put Aussie rules on the map?
I've got no doubt he has. I mean, that's by definition someone who transcends the sport. And just to, I guess, add on John's comments, one of the things, and these will all come out in the fullness of time, and John talks about Lance the competitor, and you'll hear about how much he loves the game and how invested he is in his own performance in the competition. The other thing a lot of people don't necessarily see is how good he is with the fans and how good he is with the kids. And we'll have a clinic, and they'll be looking up at him. He's 6'6". He's got when he locks in on a conversation, you're talking to him, and he's and that's generational. And we see our young supporters come in with number 23 on their back, and they won't represent Lance Franklin immediately, but there will still always be that piece when you see a Swans jumper, I'm sure, with number 23, go, well, there's, that's a tip of the hat to Lance Franklin, whether another player's wearing it down the track. But it's been huge, and that's part of, I guess, the evolution of the game and the evolution of our footy club. That without Lance, there'll be new heroes coming through, and one of the things that he has contributed to is the growth of the AFL in Sydney, and some of our really good young players are through the academy, and they're born and bred, and they would have grown up, and Errol Goulden would have grown up as a Buddy Franklin fan, and he's starting his career with Lance, and that's part of the legacy piece.
Tom, you played against him in multiple famous battles with Geelong, including the 2008 Grand Final. What was it like playing against him?
He did say, I had a chat to him after the game in the rooms on Saturday night, and I said, how's your calf? And he said to me, just like your hamstring was when I played on you. I did chase him once and tore my hamstring. So he was, to John's point, it's been an absolute privilege to see him up close and personal. And what I've loved, so from a playing, he was next level. He, last player to kick 100 goals, I think it was in 2008. But when you move out of playing, whether it's into coaching or support staff like I've been, you get to see players through a different light. And he was a better player than I thought he was, ironically. You come up against him maybe twice a year, but then you see him day in, day out. It's not a stretch to say he's certainly the generational forward of our time, and arguably the generational player of our time.
Tom, obviously, we saw the reports last week that he was thinking maybe he was open to another year. Were you expecting before the injury weekend that this week might be having that conversation with him? It's gone in a bit of a different direction.
I'll answer this the same way as last year, and we obviously all appreciate the great interest in Lance, and we've never been a club to buy into external commentary around that. And the reason for that is we're having, and John's having, conversations with Lance all the time. I think this time around, as opposed to last year, it wouldn't be unfair to say he was probably more of a two-way conversation with the club, as opposed to this time last year was, I want to play, and then we said, absolutely, you're going to help us win games. So it didn't surprise me. It didn't affect any of the conversations we're having internally, and I think the fact that we're here today, and we probably weren't thinking we'd be here today on Saturday morning, shows you how quickly things can move, and that's why you don't anchor on positions too quickly.
And John, in terms of the leadership ability Bud's brought, in terms of mentoring this next generation of forwards, like you look at Logan and Joel and Hayden, can you just speak to that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to your point before about that. What he's done to the sport's been massive, but what he's done to our footy club to be able to keep us competitive through that period and allow the next generation to come through, really important. I was really keen for him to play this year to help that next generation come through. It's not just because he can help us win us games, but because he takes the best defender and it allows others to come through and allow them to mature a bit more, those guys to try and help fill the void, which we're really confident in those guys. But to be able to have him for so long, to be able to help buffer that and give some support to that was amazing. Having him on the ground, just having him. I talked about him this morning when we were just chatting about it. I said one of the great things with Lance was in the change rooms before he ran out the race. And one of my enduring memories of Lance will be just how calm and confident he was, and almost knowing when he gets out the top of that race there, that was where he felt he's most comfortable, and the players felt that because they felt that confidence. He's a bloke who's 198 centimetres tall, standing next to him, going, "Righto, lads, we're about to go up into battle here, and everything's going to be okay." And he just had this amazing aura about him before the starts of games that you just knew, and he was in for the battle, and that was amazing to see up close.
How would you compare his, impact or significance to the club compared to, say, Adam Goods and Tony Lockett, who I guess the faces of the club, faces of the sport in Sydney for the 2 decades?
Oh, look, I think it's the game evolves, and if you mention those two in particular, when Plugger came here in the 90s, the Swans hadn't played in a final series since 1945. And then to be at the forefront of that team that had the run through to the grand final in 1996. I don't have the membership numbers and the attendance numbers on hand off the top of my bat, but they went through the roof. So they've very much sort of, Tony Plugger and Paul Kelly and these sorts of players, very much foundation setters for the club. Adam, is it unfair to make comparisons between the very top of our players. And then Lance was the first big free agent in the competition when free agency was right at its infancy, and there was no bigger name in the game at that point in time, coming off a couple of premierships at Hawthorn. So all different stories, all as influential as each other at a period of time in the club and the game. And Lance does sail off knowing that he's made a significant impact, and it's players come and go, and they're all custodians of that point in time, and the core responsibility of anyone coming through the walls of the doors of the Swans is to leave the place in a better space than when you arrived, and there's absolutely no question he's done that.
John, was there quite a bit of emotion when he spoke to the playing group this morning?
No, he was pretty good. Probably from me there was, but I'm a bit of a sook. He was actually really good. He held himself together really well. I get a bit teary in those situations. But I'm not much good at those situations. But he's really good at it. He was terrific. He was just up front and said it how it was. And my memories obviously automatically go back to the first time we met. And I didn't know him very well before he came and played for our footy club. And to be able to have that relationship build over a course of year in, year out, week in, week out, year in, year out, was one of the highlights of probably my time in coaching. Is to be able to experience not only Lance as a player, but Lance as a person, and how popular he is amongst our young players. It's not only the older players he hangs around with, he loves the younger fellas, and we saw that on some of the hub experiences. It was amazing. His closeness and ability to be able to relate to the younger blokes in our list was just incredible to watch. And I'm sure everyone that's been through those experiences with Lance over the last few years would look back on that and think, geez, that was pretty cool to be a part of that.
John, is the plan for Lance to hang around for the next month a bit, or is he going to take some space?
No, he's taking some space. Yeah, no, Lance is either right in, or he's just going to take a bit of time now with Jess and the family, which is terrific for them.
John, what does it say about someone like Lance, one of the greatest players we've seen, arguably the biggest name in the game, especially here in Sydney, yet he doesn't want to be here and have all the fanfare that other players might have just accepted in the past? Yeah,
well, look, we spoke about that, and as Tom mentioned before, what's the end look like for him? You have the ongoing conversations, and you try and make sure that every player finishes as good as they can, and some, in particular your champions, you really try your best to be able to make sure that works out well. And he was always just very low key. I don't want any fanfare, just no fanfare. And I said, well, there's a fact of life here, mate. You're one of the all-time greats. And what about that's just a fact. And he said he understands. He's not silly. He understands his spot in the game, but he's just very humble, and very private. And for those in his inner sanctum and those that he's got trust in, it's been it's, you know, you respect that enormously, and you know, that's been also a great privilege to be able to have that relationship with him over the years.
John, what do you think it meant to him to have that moment in the Swans jumper last year in Geelong, kicking down his goal? Like, what a reflection.
Yeah, I think that'll be one of the all-time great memories for him. There's no question about that. I mean, you go back and look at that, the look on his face when he was surrounded by 10, 20, 30,000 people, and that was someone that was just pure joy and relishing that moment. I remember being concerned about what was going to happen out there to our players, and Lance in particular, but just the way he embraced that moment, and I'm sure you all would have seen it, just the way he embraced it and wasn't fearful of it, and soaked it all up, was no doubt that'll be, when he looks back on his footy career in 20, 30 years' time, that thing went global, and that'll be an absolute highlight, no doubt.
Is there a small part of your coaching invested here that used the push towards the finals as motivation to send him out on the right note?
Oh, well, today's just about Lance finishing, and you know, we'll work towards that tomorrow.
John, it was a shock.
Just a couple more, please.
It was a shock when Sydney pulled off one of the biggest signatures they've ever made. How did you do it back in 2013?
We were really fortunate that he reached out to us. People think it was about the deal, and it initially was just the fact that Jess was living in Sydney, and that was the driver for him, and he wanted to come here and play footy and live in Sydney. And when I was asked, well, when I sort of got wind of that being a possibility, we had to get to work pretty quickly and get it done, because not every day you get one of the all-time greats. So he wants to come and live in Sydney and play footy for us. So I found that at the very start I was a bit unsure how we could get it done. We got it done, to the great credit of our board at the time, and Andrew Island, Dean Moore, those people that got it put it together, and the people that have had the you know, been managing it ever since. And I just look back on that moment as one of my great memories of the first time I met Lance, and how we evolved that friendship, and feel very privileged.
And sorry, just lastly, Buddy spoke about how much he'll miss the group. How much will you miss having him here?
Oh, enormously. I mean, you know, Josh Kennedy retired last year, and the older you get, the more time you spend with these guys, you get very close to them. And Lance is, you know, over the 10 years now, has been fantastic. You don't get some of the great experiences you have, and if you see him walk off the ground sometimes, and the big smile on his face after a close win, and you embrace, it's one of the great moments. But as Tom mentioned before, you know, footy clubs move on, and you know, we're thrilled when we go to a family day now that it's Isaac Heaney and Callum Mills, that the kids have got the jumpers, Errol Gordon, Chad Warner, all those guys, that next generation of Sydney Swans players that he's been able to help, and the reality is that, you know, we'll get going again and get into it this week, and away we go.